Court documents from the old Oklahoma Territory speak of a woman whose very name could quiet an entire room of plantation owners. Sarah Granger, a name murmured throughout 3 counties with a mix of fear and curiosity, faced the courts not once, but for separate times between 1847 and 1856. Every appearance was of the same strange accusation, a violent attack against a man who legally claimed ownership of her. Whenever her hearings began, women and children were escorted out before testimony even started. And each time, despite evidence that was considered overwhelming, no jury ever found her guilty. The injuries she caused were too precise, too deliberate, too lasting. 3 men lost the ability to father children afterward. A 4th lost something entirely different, his sanity, people said, though the official record merely described severe trauma requiring medical treatment. Everyone knew what she had done. The authorities, the community, even the judges. Yet something about Sarah Granger's situation made even the harshest frontier officials turn their eyes away. What could force a system built on absolute dominance to repeatedly free the woman they called its most dangerous prisoner? Before we go further into her story, I need you to do something. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Tales like this, the kind hidden deep in forgotten legal archives, almost never rise back to surface. And drop a comment telling me which state or city you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. Now, let's uncover what made Sarah Granger so feared that even the people who owned her hesitated to write her name on paper. Trying to understand Sarah Granger by appearance alone never worked. Yet those who saw her never forgot. She stood a little over 5 feet tall with hands that looked too fine-boned for someone who had spent 32 years in the cotton fields. Her face carried a single defining scar, a thin line running from her left temple down to her jaw, left by an overseer's whip when she was only 14. But her eyes were what unsettled people the most. They didn't show the lowered, defeated acceptance expected of someone in her position. Her eyes analyzed, calculated, remembered everything. Sarah was born in 1824 on a tobacco farm in northern Alabama, the daughter of a woman whose name never appeared in any ledger. Her first owner, Edmund Hartwell, was considered reasonable by local standards. He fed his enslaved workers efficiently, punished mostly when drunk, and occasionally permitted marriages among them. Sarah secretly learned to read by watching Hartwell's daughter practice her letters, studying the shapes through a crack in the schoolroom wall. That forbidden skill, dangerous but invaluable, would eventually save her life. When Hartwell died in 1842, his estate was sold to pay off gambling debts. Sarah, 18 by then, strong and quietly educated, had value. She was purchased by a cotton trader named James Wickham for $850, a price reflecting both her physical strength and what he described as her refined manner. The sale tore her away from her mother, her younger brothers, and the only home she had known. The 6-week trip west into Oklahoma Territory forced her into a wagon with 11 others, chained while the scenery shifted from green hills into endless plains. In 1842, Oklahoma Territory existed in a complicated state, officially Indian land, yet increasingly crowded with white settlers who brought their own institutions and cruelty with them. The region felt divided between identities. The Creek and Cherokee nations lived beside Presbyterian missionaries, federal soldiers, and plantation owners escaping depleted farmland back east. Towns like Tahlequah and Fort Gibson became administrative hubs where territorial law, tribal authority, and federal power clashed unpredictably. Wickham's plantation was located 15 miles south of Fort Gibson in what is now Muskogee County. 300 acres of cotton, corn, and tobacco. 42 enslaved men, women, and children worked the fields and lived in 7 cramped cabins behind the main house. The overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Walter Pute, enforced discipline with cold regularity. 20 lashes for talking while working, 30 for leaving without permission, 50 for fighting back. Punishments were carried out publicly every Saturday night, with everyone forced to watch while Pute displayed the price of disobedience. During her first 3 months there, Sarah stayed quiet and concealed her ability to read. She picked cotton with controlled efficiency, not the fastest, not the slowest. She studied which workers could be trusted and which ones traded secrets for extra food. She learned that Wickham visited the cabins on Tuesday nights whenever his wife traveled to Fort Gibson to see her sister. She learned that Pute favored the younger women, the ones who hadn't yet gained the hollow, distant look of those who had endured such attention for years. She also discovered that Wickham's wife, Charlotte, was aware of everything that happened on the property but had long since stopped caring. Once a Charleston belle, daughter of a shipping magnate, raised on French lessons and piano, Charlotte was now 34, childless, surviving on laudanum and the pretense that her husband's late-night wanderings were business inspections. She spent her days endlessly repeating the same Chopin nocturne until the music seemed to seep into the walls. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday night in late November of 1842, 5 months after Sarah arrived. Wickham appeared at her cabin doorway shortly after 10, when most of the exhausted workers had already fallen asleep. He carried no lantern. He knew the route by heart. Sarah was awake, as she often was, because Tuesday nights held a certain kind of silence. The other women in the cabin didn't react when he entered. That was the unspoken agreement. Pretend not to see, not to hear, not to know. Wickham stood over Sarah's sleeping mat for a long moment. She smelled the whiskey, the tobacco, and the pomade in his hair. When he reached down and placed a hand on her shoulder, she didn't recoil. She simply whispered, "Touch me again, and I'll kill you." He laughed, a quiet, almost affectionate sound, as though she told him a clever joke. His hand slid from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there as a reminder of the power he believed he possessed. The total control he assumed was unquestionable. What happened next? What happened next took no more than 3 seconds, though witnesses later admitted they could barely explain the sequence. Sarah's hand, hidden beneath her thin blanket, came out holding something metal. There was a sudden, violent motion. Wickham made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like all the breath being forced out of him at once, and stumbled backward into the cabin wall. Blood surged through his trousers with alarming speed. Sarah rose calmly and stepped past him into the cold November night, still gripping the cotton knife she had stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. She walked straight to the main house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on the door with the calm focus of someone delivering a message she had rehearsed. Charlotte Wickham answered, still fully dressed despite the hour, her eyes clouded with opium and something that might have been curiosity. Sarah extended the blood-covered knife, offering a handle first, and spoke clearly. "Your husband tried to force himself on me. I injured him. He's in cabin 4. He'll need a doctor." Then she sat on the porch steps and waited for whatever consequences would come. The next thing that happened was Dr. Theodore Gaines being pulled from his bed at midnight and riding 14 miles through darkness to treat an injury he refused to describe fully. When Gaines arrived, he found Wickham barely conscious, Charlotte still in the parlor playing the same nocturne, and Sarah sitting quietly on the porch as if waiting for a church service to begin. The medical notes entered into the official record described only severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In the less delicate version whispered among physicians and lawyers, Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-inch cotton knife. The cut was so clean and so exact that Gaines initially wondered if she had some kind of surgical training. Both testicles had been removed with what he later wrote in his private journal as astonishing anatomical precision. Wickham physically survived. He spent 6 weeks confined to his bedroom, while Charlotte continued her repetitive piano playing downstairs. The same 16 measures over and over, the house's only acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. In Wickham's absence, Pute managed a plantation, his punishments harsher and his temper growing shorter. But he never laid a hand on Sarah. No one did. What to do with her quickly became the most awkward legal question in the Oklahoma Territory. The law was straightforward. An enslaved person who struck a master could be executed. An enslaved person who caused permanent injury to a master should be executed. But the situation, Wickham's late-night visit, the nature of the injury, the fact that Sarah had immediately surrendered, created complications no one wished to discuss openly. The territorial judge, Samuel Breenidge, a Kentucky transplant who had spent 2 decades navigating impossible frontier contradictions, was assigned the case. He had handled land disputes between the Cherokee Nation and white settlers, treaty violations, and murder trials where tribal and federal law clashed. But Sarah Granger's case presented something different, a moral dilemma disguised as a legal proceeding. Breenidge questioned Sarah privately at the Fort Gibson courthouse. Their conversation was never officially recorded, but he later summarized parts of it to his clerk. She answered with unnerving composure. Yes, she had taken a knife 2 weeks earlier, expecting that Wickham would eventually come. Yes, she understood the anatomy well enough to guarantee the injury would be permanent. No, she felt no remorse. When Breenidge asked why she had chosen such a specific act, her reply unsettled him deeply. I want to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted just 1 day. Wickham didn't appear, officially because his doctor forbade it, but in truth because he couldn't bear the idea of his injury becoming public testimony. Pugh claimed Sarah had always been difficult, inclined toward insolence. Dr. Gaines testified regarding the severity of the injury. Charlotte Wickham didn't speak on the stand, though she remained in the gallery the entire time, her expression impossible to read. The defense came from an unexpected voice. A Creek delegate named William Harjo stood and argued that under tribal law, technically still applicable in Indian territory, Sarah's actions constituted self-defense against sexual violence. His involvement was irregular, arguably unlawful, and absolutely unprecedented, but Breenidge allowed him to speak. The jury of 12 white men deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. Chaos followed. Territorial prosecutors demanded a retrial. Plantation owners across 3 counties sent furious letters. A Baptist minister published a sermon in the Fort Gibson newspaper warning that acquitting Sarah would inspire rebellion among the enslaved population. But Judge Breenidge held firm, and Sarah was returned to Wickham's property, where she was immediately sold. Her new owner was Marcus Sheffield, a widower who managed a smaller farm 30 miles west. He purchased her for $600, $250 less than the price Wickham had paid, citing her diminished value due to criminal behavior. Sheffield was known as a moderate sort, a man who attended church every Sunday and occasionally allowed his workers to earn small wages for extra chores. Sarah lasted 4 months on Sheffield's farm before she cut him as well. Once the pattern emerged, ignoring it became impossible, though many still tried. Sheffield's injury occurred under nearly identical circumstances to Wickham's: a late-night visit to the cabins, an attempted assault, and Sarah's swift, expertly aimed retaliation. This time, she used a straight razor she had stolen from Sheffield's shaving kit, discovered beneath his bed while she cleaned the main house during her rotation. Unlike Wickham, Sheffield survived with slightly better health. Dr. Gaines was summoned again to treat an unspecified. The trauma, recorded in Dr. Gaines's journal, was severe but not entirely catastrophic. Sheffield retained partial function, though he would never father the children he had been discussing with prospective new wives only weeks earlier. The second trial drew an even larger crowd. People traveled from as far as Tahlequah, sensing that Sarah Granger's case had become something far bigger than a simple legal matter. It had turned into a public reckoning with questions the territory had long avoided. How far could someone go when defending themselves? Could a person considered property legally protect themselves from the person who owned them? And what happened when a system built on absolute rules encountered a situation that defied all absolutes? This time, Sarah took the stand. Judge Breenidge permitted her testimony, despite the prosecutor's furious objections. For 2 full hours, she described her life with a clarity that made several jurors visibly uneasy. She spoke of being sold away from her mother at 18. She explained Wickham's Tuesday night pattern, how the women in the cabin had perfected the art of pretending to sleep, lying as still as corpses. She admitted that after what she had done to Wickham, she had assumed, incorrectly, that her reputation alone would protect her from future assaults. "I believed," she said, looking directly at the jury, "that once a man knew what I could do, he would make a different choice. I was wrong. Mr. Sheffield knew every detail of what happened to Mr. Wickham. He bought me all the same." The prosecutor, a red-faced man named Harrison Tate, demanded to know whether she felt any remorse. Sarah's reply would be quoted in newspapers as far east as Richmond. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret defending myself." The second jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned the same verdict, not guilty. Sheffield sold her immediately, this time for $420, the falling price reflecting reality everyone in the territory now understood. Purchasing Sarah Granger meant accepting certain risks. Her next owner, Elias Drummond, apparently believed he was safe. He ran a cotton gin and a small mill near the Canadian River, employed 3 additional laborers, and prided himself on being a progressive sword master. He allowed marriages among his workers and let them maintain small gardens. Drummond lasted 9 months before Sarah cut him as well. The pattern repeated exactly: a late-night cabin visit, an attempted assault, and Sarah's swift, expertly delivered retaliation. This time she used a paring knife from the kitchen, sharpened to near-surgical precision on the millstone. Dr. Gaines, summoned for the 3rd time to treat another undisclosed injury, began keeping increasingly detailed notes about the consistency of Sarah's technique. In his private journal, he wrote, "She demonstrates an understanding of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical student. How she learned this, I have no explanation." The 3rd trial reached national attention. Abolitionist newspapers in Boston praised her resistance. Pro-slavery publications demanded her immediate execution, arguing that 3 separate assaults proved malice and premeditation. A delegation of plantation owners petitioned the territorial governor, claiming that Sarah's continued acquittals threatened the entire social order. But the pattern held. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite Drummond's testimony, despite 3 medical experts describing the injuries in clinical detail, the jury acquitted her once more. This time the deliberation stretched to 15 hours, and 2 jurors later admitted to a newspaper that they believed she was guilty under the law, but simply could not bring themselves to convict her. Drummond did not sell Sarah. He freed her. The manumission papers filed in December 1851 cited irreconcilable differences in temperament and included a clause barring her from returning to Muskogee County. He paid her $75, 1 year's wages for skilled labor, and arranged her transportation to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where a small community of free black residents lived along the river. Sarah spent the next 3 years in Fort Smith. She worked as a seamstress, eventually earning enough to rent a modest room above a dry goods shop. She improved her reading and writing, attending evening classes run by a Quaker teacher who never questioned her past. She might have built a quiet life there, far removed from the events that had made her name a whispered warning across the Oklahoma Territory. But in May of 1854, she returned. She walked back into Indian Territory, traveled to 43 miles to Fort Gibson, and presented herself at the courthouse. She was there to testify at a trial, not her own, but that of another woman accused of striking her master under near-identical circumstances. Just when it seemed her story could not grow darker, the horror surrounding Sarah Granger deepened. If this tale is sending a chill down your spine, share the video with someone who enjoys unsettling mysteries. Hit the like button to support the channel, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now let's continue. The woman Sarah wanted to defend was named Hannah, no last name recorded, 19 years old, accused of hitting her master with a fire poker after he forced his way into her cabin. Hannah's master survived with a shattered collarbone and severe bruising. Unlike Sarah's previous cases, where the pattern of attempted assault was painfully clear, Hannah's circumstances were murkier. The master claimed he was checking reports of illness, insisting that Hannah had attacked him without provocation. Sarah's arrival in the courtroom created immediate uproar. Judge Greenidge, now 63, visibly tired and worn down by the territory's endless contradictions, initially refused to allow her testimony. She had not witnessed the event. She had no legal standing. But Sarah was prepared. She brought documents for years' worth of correspondence with women across 3 territories, letters describing similar incidents, similar patterns of assault and retaliation, and the legal aftermath that followed each one. She had been gathering these accounts since moving to Fort Smith, using her literacy and her wages to build a network of information almost no one knew existed. Some letters came from women who were free, while many more were written by those still enslaved, messages smuggled out through the quiet network Sarah had been building with steady determination. Judge Greenidge reviewed the correspondence privately in his chambers, and what he found unsettled him enough to make a decision no one expected. He ruled that Sarah could testify, not as someone who witnessed the event, but as what he termed an expert on the subject of self-defense against sexual violence. The prosecution erupted in protest. The territorial attorney general even threatened to file an official complaint against Greenidge with the federal courts. But the judge had reached a point in his life where such threats no longer mattered. Everyone knew his health was failing, even if no official diagnosis had been recorded yet. After more than 20 years watching the legal system twist itself into knots to avoid confronting its most painful truths, he was simply done. Sarah spent 3 full days on the stand. She outlined the recurring patterns she had documented, the typical hours when assaults occurred, the excuses masters used to justify their nighttime intrusions, and the subtle systems of warnings and protective strategies enslaved communities had developed to keep each other safe. She explained the physical realities of self-defense, why certain injuries acted as the strongest deterrent, why precision mattered in situations where a woman's strength was no match for a man's. Prosecutor Harrison Tate, the same man who had failed to convict her 3 times before, kept pressing her to admit that she had planned her own defensive attacks in advance. But every time, Sarah responded in the same even tone. I prepared for the possibility of defending myself. That is not the same as planning to harm someone. Hannah was acquitted. The jurors deliberated for 19 hours, stalling multiple times before reaching a final decision. The jury foreman later admitted that it was Sarah's testimony that swayed them, not because it proved Hannah's innocence beyond doubt, but because it forced them to confront realities they had long preferred to ignore. Sarah's return to Oklahoma Territory set off a ripple effect no one had foreseen. Soon, women began seeking her out at night, arriving quietly, some traveling 20 or 30 miles just to speak with her. They came with questions about protecting themselves, about what the law truly allowed, about whether Judge Greenidge's courtroom represented a real shift or a fleeting anomaly. Sarah answered each question with her usual measured clarity. She taught them basic anatomy, not from books, which she could not risk carrying, but from memory, drawing crude diagrams in dirt and ash. She explained which injuries were most effective, which minimized danger of retaliation, which could be defended in court as proportionate responses to assault. She never urged anyone to use violence. She provided information and left each woman to choose her own path. The plantation owners, of course, noticed. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 different incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas territories, cases where enslaved women injured either masters or overseers during attempted assaults. The injuries varied in severity, but the pattern was unmistakably similar, deliberate, targeted, intended to eliminate reproductive capability. Not random attacks, calibrated acts of survival. Alarmed by the trend, 23 plantation owners formed what they called the Territorial Property Protection Committee. They hired an attorney from Richmond, Virginia, a specialist in cases involving what was politely referred to as civil insurrection. His name was Cornelius Vance, and he had a long record of successfully prosecuting resistance among the enslaved. He arrived determined to find a charge that would finally hold Sarah accountable. He couldn't retry her for prior assaults. Double jeopardy barred that. He couldn't prosecute her for literacy or teaching, since she was legally free. But he uncovered a rarely used statute from Old English common law: conspiracy to commit mayhem. Under this obscure charge, they didn't have to prove Sarah had injured anyone herself, only that she had provided knowledge or encouragement that led others to do so. The fourth trial began in August 1856. This time, the prosecution assembled 17 witnesses: masters who had been harmed, overseers who claimed they had seen Sarah meeting with women who later acted, even one woman who testified that Sarah had given explicit instructions on where to inflict injury. The courthouse overflowed with spectators, and federal marshals were stationed outside in anticipation of unrest. Judge Greenidge, frail and visibly declining, presided. Everyone understood this would likely be his final major case. Sarah's defense team, 3 attorneys from the newly formed Oklahoma Territorial Bar Association, argued that teaching self-defense was not a criminal conspiracy. They presented medical testimony asserting that the injuries, while serious, were rarely fatal. They showed evidence that women charged in similar incidents had consistently been acquitted on grounds of self-defense. But Vance was a skilled strategist. He reframed the entire narrative. Wasn't there a distinction between a desperate act of self-preservation and a carefully prepared response? Didn't Sarah's lessons amount to planning? Didn't the consistent nature of the injuries across multiple cases suggest coordination rather than coincidence? Then came the discovery that shook even the prosecution. Investigators searching Sarah's rented room above a boarding house in Fort Gibson found her hidden archive: 47 letters, 6 journals, and extensive records detailing assaults, trials, and outcomes across 5 territories. It was a complete historical ledger of resistance. Sarah had compiled an organized, meticulous record: diagrams of injuries, legal arguments that had succeeded in the past, names and stories of 43 women who had been charged for resisting their masters. Of those, 37 had been acquitted, for convicted of lesser offenses, and 2 executed. Vance held these documents up during his closing argument. This, he declared, was not simply education. It was infrastructure. Vance lifted the papers and declared, "This is not spontaneous self-defense. This is coordination. This is a deliberate effort to destabilize the very framework our society depends on." Sarah's lead attorney, a young lawyer named Robert Chenoweth, who had moved to the territory specifically to challenge slavery in court, rose for his closing argument. He spoke for 2 full hours, and his words would later be preserved in the official transcripts, reprinted by abolitionists for generations. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you've heard the prosecution insist that this is a conspiracy. I ask you, what kind of conspiracy requires no coded messages, no hidden gatherings, no layers of secrecy, because it consists only of teaching women how to defend themselves against violation? Mr. Vance calls this organized resistance. I call it the predictable result of a system that refuses to provide protection. Sarah Granger didn't create the danger these women faced. That danger existed long before she ever put pen to paper. All she did was give them the knowledge they needed to stay alive." The jury deliberated for 4 days. During that time, Fort Gibson lived in a suspended state of tension. Federal soldiers patrolled the streets, preparing for possible unrest. Plantation owners crowded into local hotels, comparing stories about workers who had become difficult since Sarah's return. Meanwhile, a group of free black residents and sympathetic white citizens kept a constant vigil outside the courthouse, standing silently as they waited for the verdict. Judge Greenidge spent those 4 days writing what would become his final statement, a personal letter addressed his daughter in Philadelphia. It survived in family archives and was published decades later in 1889. In it, he wrote, "I have presided over hundreds of cases in my 20 years on this bench. I have ordered men to be hanged, dissolved marriages, and ruled on property disputes worth fortunes. Yet none of those cases forced me to confront the question that Sarah Granger's trials have thrust upon this territory. Can a legal system based on absolute property rights admit that certain forms of property, possess the right to defend themselves? We have constructed a legal structure that requires certain people to be objects, not human beings. And then we express shock when those people remind us they are human after all. Sarah Granger is guilty of only one offense, refusing to accept the idea that her body belongs to anyone but herself. The letter was never sent. Breenidge died of heart failure on the third day of jury deliberations, collapsing in his chambers while reading case law. His death stunned the territory. Though his illness was widely known, many had treated his presence as permanent, as unmoving as the courthouse walls. Court was suspended for 3 days of mourning, then resumed under Judge William Patterson, a younger jurist far less tolerant of legal ambiguity. When the jury finally returned, the foreman looked utterly drained. He read the verdict in a voice barely louder than a whisper, not guilty on all counts. But then, breaking with all precedent, he continued reading a written statement the jury had composed together. We find the defendant not guilty of conspiracy because we cannot, in good conscience, criminalize the act of teaching women how to protect themselves from assault. However, we also recognize the concerns presented by the prosecution regarding the structured nature of this instruction. We therefore urge territorial authorities to create clear legal protections for enslaved persons against sexual assault by their masters, so that such instruction will no longer be necessary. The courtroom froze in stunned silence. The statement had no legal authority. Juries determined facts, not policy, but its message was explosive. The jurors had essentially declared that the real problem was not Sarah's work, but the system that forced women to rely on it. Vance immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the jury had overstepped its role. The Territorial Property Protection Committee offered a $500 reward for any information that could lead to Sarah being convicted on some other charge. Several newspapers demanded that she be exiled or imprisoned under vagrancy laws. But something fundamental had shifted. The once solid consensus among the white population that the system was unassailable had begun to fracture. Presbyterian ministers delivered sermons about moral contradictions in an immoral institution. Women's groups in Fort Smith and Toloqua submitted petitions to the territorial legislature urging exactly what the jury had recommended: legal protections against sexual assault. Nothing changed on paper, of course. The legislature, dominated by plantation interests, had no desire to weaken the property rights that sustained its economy. But the conversation was no longer buried. Sarah Granger's cases had forced uncomfortable truths into daylight. Throughout the uproar, Sarah remained strangely calm. She continued living in Fort Gibson, still working as a seamstress, still exchanging letters with women across multiple territories. She attended services of the African Methodist Episcopal congregation, sang in the choir, and maintained a life so ordinary it seemed almost defiant in the face of the storm she had stirred. Yet she was preparing. Over the 18 months following her fourth acquittal, she quietly transferred her documents to multiple safe places: churches, private homes, even a Creek Nation council house, where a sympathetic delegate agreed to store a trunk of letters among tribal records. She was building redundancy, ensuring that even if one archive fell, her work would remain intact. She also began training others to continue the mission. 3 women, 2 formerly enslaved, 1 freeborn, studied under her for months. She taught them not only anatomy and defensive strategy, but also the meticulous record-keeping that made her archive so powerful. She taught them to write cleanly, to note exact dates, to separate rumor from verified fact. Then, in December 1857, 2 federal marshals arrived with a new charge: mail fraud. On its face, the accusation was absurd. They claimed she had used the Postal Service to distribute information that posed a threat to public safety. The evidence amounted to a handful of seized letters and vague testimony from a postmaster who admitted he was pressured into monitoring her mail. Everyone understood this for what it was: another attempt to silence her through the courts. This next trial would be, unlike the previous 4 proceedings, this one took on a different tone entirely. From the very beginning, Judge Patterson made it unmistakably clear that he would allow no extended testimonies about self-defense or broader systems of abuse. To him, the issue was narrow and absolute. Had Sarah Granger violated federal postal laws? Everything beyond that point, he insisted, was irrelevant. The trial lasted only 2 days. The jury deliberated for barely 40 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. Patterson sentenced her to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, followed by permanent banishment from the Oklahoma Territory. As marshals escorted her out of the courtroom, Sarah turned to the gallery, her voice carrying clearly all the way to the back rows. They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I've shared. In 1858, Fort Leavenworth functioned both as a military post and as a federal prison for the surrounding territories. Sarah arrived there in January, shackled in a wagon with 3 other inmates, and was placed in the women's ward, a limestone structure holding 17 prisoners convicted of everything from theft to murder. The building itself reflected the institution's priorities. Originally built in 1847 as a storage facility, it consisted of 3 long rooms with small, high windows meant more for ventilation than actual light. Its limestone walls leaked moisture throughout the winter, creating a constant dampness that seeped into clothing, bedding, everything. And in summer, those same walls trapped heat like a furnace, turning the cramped interior into something close to unbearable. Each room held 6 women who slept on narrow wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses infested with lice and bed bugs. The harsh conditions weren't born from direct malice. The cruelty was woven into the system itself. The guards, 3 men rotated under the supervision of a matron named Mrs. Hale, treated the inmates with cold efficiency. They weren't violent, only rigid. Rules were followed with mechanical precision. Silence during work hours, single-file movement between buildings, no touching, mandatory attendance at every meal and every religious service regardless of health. During the day, the women labored in the laundry, cleaning uniforms for the garrison. Hundreds of pounds of wool and cotton had to be scrubbed in boiling water, wrung out by hand, and hung to dry in all kinds of weather. The work punished everyone equally. Women who had never touched manual labor worked beside those hardened by years in fields or factories. By the end of the month, all their hands looked identical, cracked, bleeding, constantly irritated by harsh soap and scalding water. They were allowed to write letters, though every piece of mail passed through a guard's hands before being sent. Sundays were reserved for mandatory church services, led by a Methodist chaplain named Reverend Thomas Blackwell. His sermons were long, heavy, and centered on repentance and redemption. He spoke often about divine justice, insisting that earthly punishment refined the soul for salvation. He rarely looked at the inmates themselves. His gaze hovered just above their heads, as if speaking not to women, but to the sins he imagined they embodied. Sarah adjusted to the place with the same quiet discipline that had defined her life. She worked efficiently, used only the movement she needed, caused no trouble, followed orders, and kept her thoughts guarded. Many inmates already knew her story. Newspapers had covered her trials, and word spread fast in such close quarters. Still, Sarah never confirmed nor denied anything. When Catherine, a counterfeiter from St. Louis, asked her directly, Sarah simply replied, "What I did for reasons that made sense at the time. Whatever you've heard is probably close enough." Inside the women's ward, a familiar social order had formed, just as it does in every confined environment. There were the politicals, like Sarah, whose crimes carried ideological weight. There were the unfortunates, women in prison for theft or prostitution, crimes of poverty rather than intent. And then there were the dangerous, 3 women convicted of murder who occupied their own silent territory. The politicals and unfortunates mingled more easily. The dangerous were generally avoided unless interaction was unavoidable. Sarah existed in an unusual middle ground. Her crimes were violent, which should have placed her among the dangerous, yet the nature of her actions, defensive rather than predatory, gave her a kind of respected distance. Women sought her guidance, Not about violence, but about survival. How to endure. How to keep dignity in a system designed to grind it away. How to remain a person when the institution wanted you to dissolve into your crime. Her advice was always practical. To younger women terrified of the years ahead, count the days if it helps, or don't count them at all. Find a rhythm that makes time livable instead of unbearable. To older women worn down by repeated sentences, you know this place better than the guards. Use that. Be invisible when it protects you, visible when it matters. To everyone, write letters, record everything. Our only power is to be remembered truthfully. What the authorities didn't realize was that Sarah had prepared for this outcome long before her final trial. She had already secured her documents, trained 3 successors, and ensured the archive she built could survive without her. It now existed in dispersed form across 3 territories, in churches, private homes, and tribal archives, copied and recopied by women who understood its significance. One of those successors, Elizabeth, managed to send Sarah a coded letter in March, smuggled through a chain involving a sympathetic worker and a guard's abolitionist-leaning wife. The message was short, written carefully to avoid suspicion. The garden you planted continues to grow. We've gathered seeds and scattered them in new places. The varieties you cultivated are thriving exactly as you prepared them to. We tend them with care and remember you with gratitude. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then fed it to the coal stove in the laundry room, watching it curl and blacken. The meaning had reached her. That was all she needed. Her work continued, and knowing that gave her an unexpected sense of calm within Fort Leavenworth's stone walls. Yet imprisonment had given Sarah something she hadn't truly foreseen. Time. Time to think, to evaluate, to consider whether the path she had chosen had been worth everything it had cost her. In letters to friends back in Fort Gibson, carefully read by guards who struggled to censor them because they contained nothing directly forbidden, she began expressing a more layered understanding of her own choices. "I did what I believed was necessary," she wrote to a friend in March 1858. "And under the same circumstances, I would make the same decisions again. But I wonder now whether I became so focused on the immediate act of resistance that I never asked myself what comes afterward. Defending ourselves is essential, but then what? How do we move beyond resistance and into freedom? How do we build lives that don't demand we become dangerous just to survive?" In another letter from April, she reflected on the women around her. Some here committed their offenses out of sheer desperation, not principle. One stole bread because her children were starving. Another killed a man who had beaten her for years. Their stories remind me that resistance takes many shapes, not all strategic. Sometimes survival itself is a form of rebellion. Sometimes just existing, refusing to disappear, is the most radical act there is. These letters circulated quietly through her network, copied and shared in whispered conversations. They revealed a Sarah Granger far more thoughtful and conflicted than the figure shaped by courtroom transcripts and newspaper coverage. Not a hero or villain, but a woman wrestling with the weight of her decisions, trying to find a philosophy of resistance that stretched beyond her own life. The prison routine dulled the senses, a rhythm some women found steady and others found suffocating. Wake at 5:30. Breakfast of cornmeal mush and bitter coffee. Work from 7 to noon. Lunch of bread and bean soup. Work again from 1 until 6. Dinner of more bread, sometimes with a scrap of salt pork. Lights out at 8. Sundays differed only in the addition of 2 church services, framing a day of forced rest that felt more like prolonged confinement. Sarah measured time by the changing light through the high windows, watching how the sun's angle crawled across the laundry floor as the seasons moved. Spring carried longer days and the faint smell of prairie grass through the vents. Summer arrived with intense heat and the far-off rhythm of military drills. Autumn brought cool winds and migrating geese whose calls cut through even the thick stone. Winter delivered cold and darkness that seeped into everything. Then, in July 1858, 6 months into her sentence, something unexpected occurred. A coalition of women submitted a petition to the territorial governor requesting Sarah's early release, arguing that her conviction rested on technicalities used to silence her rather than to uphold justice. The petition bore 127 signatures: white women, black women, Creek women, Cherokee women, crossing racial, cultural, and legal lines that rarely touched. The petition was a carefully composed document. It acknowledged that Sarah had technically broken male regulations, then dismantled the legitimacy of that conviction point by point. It highlighted the inconsistent enforcement of postal rules. Many use a male for similar purposes without punishment. It noted the unusually brief trial, the exclusion of evidence showing selective prosecution, and the disproportionate sentence. Most striking of all, the petition argued that Sarah's true crime had been teaching women how to fend themselves from assault, something that should be recognized as an act of public service, not conspiracy. It was bold language, even risky, yet 127 women had still signed their names. Some were wives of military officers posted across Kansas and Oklahoma. Others were teachers, shopkeepers, farmers' wives, respectable women who risked their reputations by associating themselves with her cause. Governor William Seward, unrelated to the senator, dismissed the petition without comment, but its existence mattered. It proved that Sarah's influence reached far beyond enslaved and formerly enslaved communities. Her message had touched women who had the most to lose by supporting her. News of the petition reached Fort Leavenworth through informal channels. During a laundry inspection, Mrs. Hale mentioned it with practiced neutrality. "Seems you got friends raising a fuss for you. Won't change a thing, but there it is." Sarah gave no outward reaction. But that night, lying on her narrow wooden platform, she allowed herself a brief flicker of something close to hope. Not hope for early release, since she was too realistic for that, but hope that her work would endure beyond the prison walls, that the seed she planted would continue to grow. The petition produced one unintended effect. It brought more attention to Sarah inside the prison. Colonel Marcus Hayes, the commandant, worried she might be organizing the inmates or using her correspondence to coordinate resistance. He ordered that her letters be read with greater scrutiny and that her interactions be monitored closely. Mrs. Hale was told to report anything unusual, attempt to build alliances, share information, or influence others. But Sarah had foreseen this as well. From the very beginning, she maintained relationships that were friendly but shallow. She offered advice only when asked and never initiated political conversations. Her letters home were crafted with care, gratitude, reflections on prison life, questions about the well-being of friends, nothing that could be considered subversive. And so the authorities found nothing. August brought a brutal heat wave that turned the women's ward into something close to torment. The limestone walls that trapped cold so thoroughly in winter now held. The heat settled into the stone walls with the same intensity that those walls held winter cold. Women collapsed at the laundry tubs, overcome by the suffocating temperatures. The straw mattresses turned into nesting ground for insects that thrived in the miserable conditions. Mrs. Hale tried to intervene, requesting permission to shift the work hours to early mornings when the air was cooler, but Colonel Hayes refused. Rules, he said, had to remain unaltered. Discipline depended on predictability. That August, 3 women died, 1 from heat stroke, 2 from dysentery that swept through the cramped living quarters with alarming speed. Their deaths were recorded in the prison log with detached efficiency. Names, dates, causes. Their burials in the prison cemetery were equally minimal. Afterward, life in the prison resumed with the same mechanical indifference as before. Sarah endured the heat, using the same methods that had gotten her through every difficult place she had lived. She drank water in measured intervals, paced her energy with care, and used the mental discipline she had learned long ago, the ability to detach her mind from the physical suffering of the moment. These techniques had shaped her survival in the cotton fields under the Alabama sun, carried her through the journey to Oklahoma territory, and now served her once again. Pain, she had learned, was guaranteed. How you processed it was what determined whether it became suffering. By September, When temperatures finally eased, Sarah had lost far too much weight. Her hands, already damaged from the work, developed sores that refused to heal in the constant damp. A cough settled in her chest, mild at first, only a nagging irritation that interfered with sleep. Mrs. Hale noticed but didn't report it. In a place like Fort Leavenworth, minor ailments were routine and usually resolved on their own. Reporting every ache and cough meant more paperwork, and no one wanted that. By October, the cough deepened. She began running light fevers that came and went. Still, she kept working. Stopping would cost her privileges and could even result in punishment for feigned illness. But her pace slowed. Tasks that once took an hour stretched into an hour and a half. Other inmates saw it and quietly compensated, adjusting their own workloads so that the guards wouldn't question the output. By early November, there was no disguising how sick she was. The cough had become relentless, shaking her until she struggled to breathe. The fever spiked higher, leaving her disoriented. This time, Mrs. Hale acted. She reported Sarah's condition to the prison doctor, Albert Richardson, who came to the women's section once a week. On November 8th, he examined her. His diagnosis was immediate and certain: pneumonia, brought on by cold, damp walls, an exhausted immune system, and a constant exposure to harsh laundry chemicals. He recommended bed rest, improved food, and a transfer to the infirmary, a separate building with better airflow and heating. Colonel Hayes approved the transfer, but denied the request for increased rations. The prison, he insisted, operated under fixed budgets. Better meals for the sick would create expectations they could not afford. Richardson argued that without proper nutrition, her chances of recovery were slim. Hayes merely shrugged. Sarah was a federal prisoner. He said, serving time for offenses against public order. The government's responsibility was to confine her, not to ensure her recovery. The infirmary held 6 beds in a single room for already occupied. 2 women with tuberculosis, one recovering from a broken collarbone, and another fading from a wasting illness no one could name. Sarah's bed was placed near the window, helpful for breathing, harmful for her fever. For 3 weeks, she drifted in that strange borderland between life and death. Some days, she seemed stronger, able to sit up and sip broth, even exchange a few words with other patients. Other days, she couldn't tell waking from dreaming, her mind sliding through memories and visions without edges. She dreamed of Alabama, of her mother, whose name she never learned, of brothers sold away before their faces had settled firmly in her memory. She dreamed of cotton fields and the scar on her face, the moment she realized survival meant becoming dangerous. She dreamed of judges and juries staring at her with expressions she still struggled to interpret. Fear, horror, but something else too: respect, recognition. She dreamed about the women she had trained, the letters she had kept, the archive she had created. In those dreams, the archive became a real structure, a building made of paper and ink, with walls built from a counter-resistance and a roof made from countless stories of women refusing to accept their own erasure. People wandered through it, reading the walls, learning from the preserved memories. The structure stood solid and indestructible, safe from fire, water, or deliberate destruction. Reverend Blackwell, the prison chaplain, visited the infirmary every few days. He would sit near her bed and speak about repentance, divine will, and the peace found in surrendering pride. Sarah listened when she was awake. When she wasn't, his words faded into the background. During his final visit in late November, she was clear-headed enough to speak. "Have you ever thought," she whispered, "that what people call sin might sometimes be refusing to participate in something worse? That defending yourself isn't the same as attacking?" Blackwell considered the thought longer than she expected. At last he said, "Scripture teaches submission to authority, turning the other cheek, giving to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. These teachings exist for a reason." "They exist," Sarah replied, her voice thin, "because they serve the powerful. They weren't written by women alone in cabins, waiting for a man to force his way in. They weren't written by people forced to choose between violence and being violated. Blackwell had nothing to say to that. He sat beside her silently for several minutes, offered a short prayer, and left. He never returned. Dr. Richardson continued visiting daily, monitoring her decline with professional composure that occasionally slipped into frustration. He knew she was dying. He had understood the truth long before anyone else admitted it. It was preventable. All of it. Better food, warmer quarters, timely medical care. Any one of those things could have shifted the entire outcome. But the system she lived under had no room for compassion or flexibility. So Dr. Richardson did what the system allowed. He recorded her steady decline in the detached language of medicine, marked every worsening symptom, and waited for the ending he knew was coming. On December 1st, something unexpected happened. Sarah had a rare moment of clarity. The fever eased for a short time, leaving her weak but fully aware. She asked Mrs. Hale for paper and a pen, explaining that she needed to write final letters. Hale hesitated. Dying inmates weren't usually granted such privileges, but there was something about the calm, steady way Sarah asked that made her agree. Sarah spent the afternoon writing 3 letters, her progress slow and interrupted by long pauses to conserve strength. The first letter went to her friends in Fort Gibson, thanking them for everything they had done and urging them to continue the work she had dedicated her life to. The second was for Elizabeth and the other women she had trained, giving them her last instructions for continuing the archive and expanding the network. The third letter was addressed to Judge Breenidge's daughter in Philadelphia. The judge had passed away, but Sarah had learned that his daughter had become active in abolitionist work. In that final letter, Sarah wrote, "Your father understood something that very few in his position were willing to see, that law without justice becomes nothing but organized violence. He allowed me to defend myself because he recognized that the system he served was morally broken. I hope you will continue the work he could not finish, questioning the assumptions others accept without thought, insisting that the law serve human beings rather than property. Tell your children that once, in Oklahoma Territory, there was a judge who chose conscience over convenience. In a better world, that wouldn't be remarkable. In this one, it deserves to be remembered." She sealed the letters and handed them to Mrs. Hale, who promised she would send them out. Whether she truly did is unknown. No official record survived. But years later, all 3 letters were found in historical archives, suggesting that they had indeed reached the people they were meant for. On December 2nd, Sarah's fever returned with renewed force. She slipped in and out of awareness, her breathing shallow and uneven. Dr. Richardson raised her laudanum dosage, choosing comfort over clarity. There was nothing more he could do. Sarah Granger died just after sunrise on December 3rd, 1858. She was 34 years old. The official record listed her cause of death as pneumonia complicated by physical decline. 2 other women were present, the tuberculosis patient and Mrs. Hale, who stayed through the night even though she wasn't scheduled to be there. They later said Sarah's last words, spoken so softly they nearly missed them, were, "The work continues." She was buried later that day in the prison cemetery, in an unmarked grave like so many others who died under federal custody. A simple wooden marker was placed at the spot, 1858 to 117, showing she was the 117th death that year. No family came. Her mother and brothers had been scattered by slave sales long ago, their whereabouts lost to time. Reverend Blackwell read a short, generic burial service, the same one he delivered for every prisoner. In his journal, he noted that Sarah died without repentance for her crimes, yet without bitterness. Mrs. Hale, standing quietly at the edge of the mandatory gathering, later wrote to her sister, "I have seen many women pass through this place, and almost all of them leave broken in some way. Sarah Granger was different. She remained herself until her final moment. I don't know whether that makes her story tragic or victorious. Perhaps it is both." News of Sarah's death reached Oklahoma Territory 2 weeks later, carried by a military courier who delivered the mail to Fort Gibson. The territorial newspaper published a small notice in its death column. Sarah Granger, convicted of mail fraud. Deceased at Fort Leavenworth, December 3rd. No services planned. The deliberate brevity kept her death small, insignificant, bureaucratic. But within certain circles, the news traveled differently. It spread through churches, private gatherings, and whispered conversations. People who had known her, or had only heard of her work, reacted in ways that reflected her complicated impact. Among plantation owners and territorial authorities, the response was quiet relief mixed with discomfort. The Territorial Property Protection Committee made no public comment, but several members privately expressed satisfaction. Cornelius Vance, the Richmond attorney who had finally secured a conviction, wrote to a colleague, "The Granger problem has resolved itself through natural means. Perhaps now things will return to normal." Yet even he added a note of doubt. "Though I suspect the damage she caused may endure longer than any of us expect." He was right. In the communities Sarah had influenced, the reaction was the opposite. Her death didn't weaken their resolve. It strengthened it. The archive she created became even more precious, guarded with new intensity. Her 3 trained successors threw themselves into the work with a sense of responsibility that bordered on sacred duty. Elizabeth, whose full name was never recorded, wrote in her journal 3 days after hearing the news, "She taught us that knowledge is the only form of power no one can take from us." They imprisoned her body and quieted her voice, but they could not erase what she preserved. Her work continues. It will continue. It must continue until the world no longer needs such records. To honor her, we must be as careful, as thoughtful, and as fearless as she was in building something that outlives any one of us. And remarkably, the system Sarah built did not collapse after her death. It grew stronger. In the 18 months that followed, her network expanded beyond what even she had achieved. New correspondents joined from Missouri, Arkansas, and even Tennessee. Women who never met Sarah but learned of her through letters, stories, and the ripple effect of her legacy. They send their own accounts, their observations, their acts of resistance. The archive grew broader, deeper, more powerful. Even as the woman who created it lay in an unmarked grave, this growth did not come without danger. In April 1859, officials in Arkansas intercepted a packet of letters being carried between Fort Smith and a church in Little Rock. The letters contained detailed descriptions of attacks by plantation owners and notes about the legal proceedings that followed. 5 women were taken into custody and charged with conspiracy and seditious correspondence. Their trial drew significant public attention, with prosecutors directly connecting the women's actions to groundwork laid by Sarah Granger. But the trial produced consequences prosecutors never foresaw. Defense attorneys used the proceedings to enter the full contents of the confiscated letters into the official court record, thereby forcing the evidence into the public domain. Local newspapers, drawn to the case for its sensational aspects, ended up publishing material that raised uncomfortable questions about the systems governing enslaved people. Though all 5 women were found guilty, the evidence was too clear to dismiss. They received unexpectedly lenient sentences, 6 months in county jail rather than federal imprisonment, with time counted from the date of arrest. When issuing the decision, the judge remarked that while conspiracy charges were legally sound, lawmakers needed to consider conditions that led to such actions rather than merely punishing those who attempted to record them. It wasn't reform, but it was something else, an acknowledgement. Sarah's work had pushed conversations into the public sphere where they could no longer be entirely ignored. The archives she created survived for decades after her death. The materials scattered across different territories in the late 1850s were gradually gathered together throughout the 1870s and 1880s as formerly enslaved communities began preserving their own histories. Some documents found their way into church basements in Fort Gibson and Tahlequah, wrapped in oilcloth and stored in wooden trunks. Others were absorbed into the earliest African-American historical societies forming in major cities. A substantial portion was transferred to the Creek Nation archives, where tribal historians recognized the documents as vital evidence of a time when their land had been caught between conflicting legal and moral systems. One of the most remarkable preservation stories involved a Presbyterian minister named Harold Thompson, who served in Fort Gibson in the 1850s. Thompson had been uneasy about slavery, not an abolitionist, but deeply troubled by what he saw. After the Civil War, while reviewing old church records, he discovered that his predecessor had hidden a collection of Sarah's letters in a concealed compartment beneath the pulpit. Instead of burning or discarding them, Thompson carefully organized the documents, added his own contextual notes, and eventually donated them to a seminary library in Ohio. His accompanying letter, written in 1877, explained, "These papers disturbed me greatly when I first uncovered them. They describe a world I witnessed but refused to confront. Acts of resistance I knew were happening but chose to overlook. I preserve them not because they make my generation look honorable, but because future generations should know the truth, not the softened version we tell ourselves to keep our consciences undisturbed." The legal legacy of Sarah's trials was equally complicated and long-lasting. Though none of her acquittals created formal legal precedent, they were too bound to specific circumstances. They influenced how territorial courts handled similar cases in the following years. Between 1859 and 1865, at least 11 cases involving enslaved individuals charged with attacking their enslavers referenced territorial reasoning on self-defense under coercion, even if Sarah Granger's name never appeared in the transcripts. Judges seemed to understand that her trials had quietly established a standard that couldn't be ignored outright. Defense attorneys learned how to invoke the principles born from her cases without directly naming the controversial figure behind them. As a result, Sarah's impact on regional legal thinking was real, though often invisible in official documents. Her name rarely surfaced, but the logic her trials produced continued shaping verdicts. Yet even more influential than her effect on courts was her cultural legacy. The women she trained carried on her work, recording violence, tracking legal outcomes, teaching anatomy and self-defense, and building networks of communication that became crucial during the turmoil of the Civil War and afterward. When Union forces occupied Oklahoma Territory in 1863, they found Black communities that were remarkably organized, with detailed records of property, family structures, and a strong understanding of legal processes. Major Benjamin Harris, a Union officer overseeing contraband camps near Fort Gibson, wrote in his report, "The Negro population here shows an unexpected degree of organization and legal awareness. They keep thorough documentation of their circumstances and clearly understand their rights under military authority. This preparedness suggests systems of education and communication that long predate our presence." He had no idea he was witnessing the results of Sarah Granger's 10-year-old initiative, but some of the people he met knew. They remembered, even if they couldn't fully explain to Union officers how their communities had learned to document and organize themselves. The three men Sarah injured, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond, lived out their later years in obscurity, never publicly acknowledging their involvement in her story. James Wickham sold his Oklahoma plantation in 1860 at a steep loss and relocated to New Orleans, where he invested in cotton trading. He never remarried or had children, and ultimately died alone in a boarding house during the yellow fever epidemic of 1873. His estate records revealed a man of limited means who never regained the wealth he held before that November night in 1842. Among his belongings, one item puzzled the administrators: a newspaper clipping about Sarah's trials, carefully stored in his leather wallet. Why he kept it, no one could say. Marcus Sheffield remained in Oklahoma Territory, eventually serving 2 terms in the territorial legislature during the 1860s. He was known as a moderate voice on Reconstruction issues, promoting gradual integration policies that pleased neither former enslavers nor freedmen. In 1869, he addressed the legislature with a speech aimed at helping the territory reconcile its past with the future it hoped to build. His words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the wrongs that had shaped the region, yet never openly admitting his own part in them. One line in particular stayed with listeners: "We created a system that forced unimaginable burdens onto certain people, then acted stunned when they resisted." Recognizing this may guide us towards something better. He never once mentioned Sarah Granger in that speech, or in any public remarks afterward. But those familiar with the real history understood the indirect reference. Sheffield died in 1881, outliving Sarah by 23 years. Elias Drummond, who had freed Sarah and paid her to leave after the third incident, followed the most unexpected path. By the early 1860s, he was openly supporting emancipation. He joined the newly formed Republican Party in Oklahoma Territory and served as a delegate at several Reconstruction conventions. His stance won the anger of former associates and threats from groups violently opposed to racial equality. In 1867, during a heated public meeting in Fort Gibson, someone finally confronted him directly about his past with Sarah Granger. A newspaper reporter wrote down his reply. "I made the same mistake many others did, believing that legal ownership excused moral failure. I was corrected in a way I could neither deny nor misunderstand. That correction changed how I saw the world. If my current views seem surprising to you, perhaps consider what your own correction might look like. Whether this shift reflected genuine moral growth or simply political survival remains uncertain." Still, Drummond's later advocacy produced real, tangible changes, including support for African American schools and legal aid organizations in Oklahoma Territory. He died in 1889, having helped build institutions that would have been impossible under the very system he once upheld. The cemetery at Fort Leavenworth, where Sarah was originally buried, went through several reorganizations over the decades. By the 1920s, the section containing federal prisoners had been cleared out, with the graves moved to make space for military burials. Sarah's remains, along with those of many other inmates, were relocated to an unmarked mass grave near the prison's eastern edge. A small stone marker, placed in 1934 by a women's historical society, simply states that federal prisoners from 1850 to 1880 rest there. It includes no names. The inscription reads, "Here rest those whose lives ended in federal custody. May their stories not be forgotten." A memorial meant for everyone, and truly belonging to no one. Exactly the sort of erasure Sarah had fought against throughout her life. In 1891, 33 years after Sarah's death, a researcher named Margaret Hutchinson uncovered a trunk filled with Sarah's letters in a Presbyterian church in Tahlequah. Hutchinson was compiling an extensive history of Oklahoma Territory for a national publication and had been interviewing elderly residents about their memories of the era before the Civil War. Several women mentioned Sarah Granger, describing her in ways that at first made Hutchinson doubtful. The account sounded too dramatic, too perfectly aligned with abolitionist legends to be entirely real. But the letters and journals confirmed that the core of the story was true. Hutchinson spent 6 months authenticating the documents, checking them against court files, newspaper archives, and military records from Fort Leavenworth. Every detail lined up. Sarah had been precise. Dates matched the records, names appeared in census logs, and legal events aligned with documented court proceedings. Sarah was, among other things, a careful historian of her own life. Hutchinson published her research in 1893 in a lengthy article titled "A Peculiar Case of Resistance: The Life and Legal Trials of Sarah Granger." It appeared in a respected historical journal and caused a modest stir in academic circles. Her work was balanced and thoughtful, avoiding hero worship or condemnation, instead presenting Sarah as a complex figure whose actions forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths about law, morality, and resistance. Mainstream historians, however, largely ignored the article. They were busy promoting a version of the antebellum era that softened the brutality of slavery and minimized the scale of resistance. The lost cause narrative was spreading, and stories like Sarah's disrupted the preferred myth of benevolent masters and loyal workers disturbed only by outsiders. But in other communities, especially among African American scholars and women's rights advocates, Hutchinson's work gained traction. It was reprinted in reform journals, quoted in speeches, and used in emerging research on resistance and personal agency under slavery. Sarah Granger's name began appearing in histories from which it had long been absent, Though her story continued to spark debate and discomfort, by the early 1900s, much of Sarah's archive had been scattered again. Fires destroyed some collections housed in churches and community centers. Other documents were intentionally hidden during times when preserving records of resistance posed serious danger. A few sets survived in private hands, passed quietly through families who recognized their value even if they couldn't safely share them. The Oklahoma Territory Sarah once knew changed beyond recognition. Statehood arrived in 1907, bringing new laws and new tensions. The community she had once served shifted, adapted, sometimes flourished, and sometimes struggled under changing realities. Yet many of the practices she introduced, her insistence on documentation, the network she helped establish, and the understanding that preserving knowledge was itself a form of resistance, survive in altered but recognizable forms. Most of the women mentioned in Sarah's letters passed away without their lives being recorded anywhere beyond what she had written. They lived, pushed back when they could, endured when they couldn't, and eventually faded from living memory into fragmented historical traces. Their individual stories disappeared, but the patterns Sarah identified and preserved remained visible to anyone who knew how to look. The three men Sarah wounded, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond, carried the full truth of their experiences to their graves. Whatever guilt, regret, bitterness, or realization they may have felt stayed private, never documented, never passed on. Their descendants, if they knew anything about the past, chose not to keep that part of the family record. Some silences are intentional. The legal precedents created by Sarah's trials proved fragile. Later courts sometimes cited them, sometimes ignored them altogether, depending on politics, judges, and public mood. But the questions her cases forced into the open, questions about property versus personhood, about self-defense under oppression, about the moral limits of legal authority, never disappeared. They simply remained unresolved, impossible to settle within the systems that created them. What Sarah Granger understood, and what made her uniquely dangerous to the society she challenged, was something deceptively simple. Resistance only becomes powerful when it is documented. A lone act of defiance can disappear, but a recorded one can be analyzed, shared, learned from. She turned isolated moments of self-defense into a visible pattern, private suffering into evidence of systemic cruelty, personal incidents into proof of a much larger truth. That shift from individual experience to collective knowledge posed a far greater threat than any single act of violence. A woman defending herself was a problem. A woman teaching others to defend themselves was a crisis. But a woman who documented everything, preserved the proof, and built systems to pass that knowledge across generations, that was revolutionary. The system responded the only way it knew how, through legal machinery designed to silence her, without turning her into a martyr, to punish without creating heroes, to neutralize her while still maintaining the illusion of justice. They convicted her on technicalities, locked her far from her community, and waited for illness to finish what the courts could not do openly. But Sarah had prepared for that possibility. Her archive didn't rely on her survival. The knowledge she shared had spread too widely to be destroyed. The methods she created had become habits for enough people that they lived on automatically, without needing her guidance. She had built something built to outlast her, and it did. In the end, Sarah Granger's story is about the persistence of knowledge, about how information refuses to die when enough people believe it matters. It's about the bravery required not only to resist, but to record that resistance, even when the record itself could be used against you. It's about the complicated intersections of violence and self-defense, of law and morality, of personal survival and collective struggle. The questions raised by her life and death, about justice, about resistance, about the cost of dignity, remained unanswered when she died in 1858, and they stayed unanswered for generations. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be resolved, only asked again and again, with each generation forced to confront them in its own moment. Sarah Granger died at 34, buried in an unmarked grave. Her body was disposed of with bureaucratic indifference, her name intentionally left off memorials. Yet the work she did, the knowledge she preserved, the network she built, Survived her for decades. Changed, adapted, but still recognized with anyone who understood what they were seeing. History is full of people who fought battles we benefit from without ever lifting a finger ourselves. Some are honored with statues and holidays. Others are nearly erased, known only through scattered papers and half-remembered stories. Sarah Granger belonged to the second group. Too controversial to celebrate, too important to erase. She exists in that uneasy space where history admits something happened, but still hesitates to say what it meant. What do you think of this story? Were Sarah Granger's actions justified in the world she lived in? How should we understand resistance that relies on violence for survival? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this historical mystery, this journey into a life that challenged the legal and moral foundations of its time, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates deep, complicated history. The past is never as simple as we want it to be. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse easy answers. See you in the next video.